September 14, 1986. A cornfield outside Enos, Indiana, just across the Illinois border. The car door hung open. Engine still warm. Keys missing. Anthony Spilotro's body lay face down in the dirt. Beaten. Stripped. Unrecognizable. Hours later, his brother Michael was found in the same shallow grave. Las Vegas called it a disappearance. Chicago called it discipline. But the fatal mistake wasn't made in that cornfield. It wasn't made in court. It wasn't made in a casino counting room. It was made weeks earlier. Inside a moving car. By a man paid to drive. The outfit had rules. Chains of command. Permission before blood. Someone violated that order. And when the commission in Chicago learned how Las Vegas operations were unraveling, how heat was rising, how indictments were forming, it traced the exposure not just to skimming, but to talk, loose movement, unauthorized meetings, and a driver who saw too much. Casino never showed that. The mistake wasn't violence. It was visibility. Anthony Spilotro did not begin in Las Vegas. He began in Chicago. Born in 1938, raised in a working-class Italian neighborhood, he entered the outfit early, through family connections and street reputation. By his 20s, he was already known for enforcement work, collections, intimidation, discipline. In Chicago, violence was a language. Spilotro spoke it fluently. The outfit was not a loose gang. It was a corporate machine, a hierarchy with layers: boss, street boss, capos, crews. Decisions were filtered upward. Permission was mandatory. Independent action was dangerous. By the 1970s, Chicago had a new frontier, Las Vegas. Casinos were cash-heavy. Surveillance was primitive compared to today. The skim, removing profits before they were officially recorded, became one of the most lucrative organized crime rackets in American history. Chicago needed someone in Vegas. Not a visionary. Not a diplomat. An enforcer. Spilotro was sent west to protect the skim. Officially, he was just another face in the desert. Unofficially, he was Chicago's eyes and fists. He reported upward. Not to casino managers. Not to local bookmakers. To the bosses back home. Around him formed a small inner circle. Associates, burglars, loyalists. Among them, drivers. Drivers in organized crime were more than chauffeurs. They were proximity. They heard conversations. They knew meeting locations. They understood tension shifts. They observed who was nervous and who was confident. They were trusted, but never equal. In Las Vegas, Spilotro began building more than protection. He built influence. He controlled bookmakers. He intimidated competitors. He ran a burglary crew later known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang. That was not what Chicago sent him to do. The skim required invisibility. Spilotro preferred dominance. And dominance creates attention. Attention creates paper trails. And paper trails create federal interest. The structure that elevated him would eventually judge him. But first, he had to rise higher. Las Vegas in the late 1970s was not yet corporate. It was transitional, vulnerable. Behind the polished casino floors, money moved in quiet corridors, count rooms without cameras, private flights carrying envelopes east to Chicago. The skim was systematic. Portions shaved before profits were declared. Millions disappearing without receipts. Anthony Spilotro was installed to protect that pipeline. Officially, he held no visible title. Unofficially, he answered directly to Chicago's upper administration. His authority came not from Nevada, but from Cicero. Inside Vegas, he operated carefully at first. Meetings in private homes. Conversations in parked cars. Associates rotated. Drivers changed routes to avoid predictable patterns. He understood surveillance. But power alters caution. As his confidence grew, so did his footprint. Spilotro began expanding beyond protection. He inserted himself into local rackets, loan sharking, sports betting, jewelry theft rings. The burglary crew he oversaw operated aggressively, drilling through walls of high-end homes and businesses. Profits were strong. Discipline was weak. This was deviation. Chicago tolerated controlled risk. It did not tolerate ego. At the same time, federal agencies were adapting. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force in Las Vegas began coordinating with Chicago field offices. Wiretaps increased. Informants were cultivated. Surveillance logs thickened. Spilotro's name surfaced repeatedly. Inside the outfit, perception mattered more than legality. If a capo appeared reckless, if his actions invited indictments, he threatened the entire hierarchy. Drivers noticed the change first. Routes grew longer, conversations sharper. Spilotro's temper shortened. He distrusted casino executives. He suspected federal pressure. He felt watched. He was correct. The Nevada Gaming Commission began scrutinizing casino ownership structures. Hidden investors linked to Midwest crime families were quietly exposed. Hearings loomed. Licenses were at risk. For Chicago bosses, Las Vegas was not personal. It was revenue. If one man jeopardized that revenue, loyalty became negotiable. Spilotro continued to escalate. He authorized intimidation without prior clearance. He deepened ties with volatile associates. He began operating like a boss rather than an emissary. That was the shift. Not a single violent act. Not one burglary. The shift was structural. He blurred the chain of command. And in organized crime, hierarchy is survival. Once leadership senses autonomy where obedience should be, containment begins. Spilotro was still powerful, but he was no longer protected. The burglary crew was supposed to be supplemental. It became central. By 1981, the hole-in-the-wall operations were no longer discrete side ventures. They were reckless. Jewelry stores, high-end residences, commercial properties, walls drilled, safes cracked, associates bragging in bars. Visibility increased. One arrest led to another. One search warrant uncovered more names. The FBI began connecting the burglaries to Spilotro directly. Surveillance teams documented meetings between him and crew members. Informants whispered about protection money flowing upward. The case was no longer local, it was federal. But the real fracture wasn't law enforcement. It was authorization. Spilotro had begun approving violent acts without Chicago's consent. Threats escalated. A suspected informant was beaten without clearance. A casino executive was intimidated in a way that triggered internal complaints. Las Vegas heat spilled back toward Illinois. The skim required silence. Spilotro generated headlines. Then came indictments. In 1983, federal prosecutors secured charges against members of the burglary crew. Court proceedings exposed internal relationships. Names surfaced in testimony. Chicago leadership began reviewing transcripts. This was not controlled risk. This was exposure. The final breach was psychological. Spilotro stopped seeking guidance. He acted first, informed later. That inversion, action before approval, violated the outfit's architecture. In a hierarchy built on permission, autonomy resembles rebellion. Drivers sensed the tension in private meetings. Calls became shorter. Messages relayed through intermediaries. Invitations to Chicago slowed. In organized crime, silence from leadership is not neutrality. It is evaluation. Meanwhile, the FBI escalated its strategy. Prosecutors prepared broader conspiracy charges. RICO statutes loomed. If the Vegas operation collapsed publicly, the skim trail could reach the Midwest. And Chicago would not allow that. The turning point was not a shootout. Not a courtroom verdict. It was internal. A realization inside Chicago's leadership. Anthony Spilotro was no longer protecting the operation. He was endangering it. And once that judgment is reached, outcomes narrow. By the mid-1980s, organized crime was no longer operating in the shadows alone. Washington had shifted strategy. RICO prosecutions were no longer experimental, they were surgical. Federal attorneys weren't targeting individual crimes. They were targeting structures. Conspiracies, entire chains of command. In Las Vegas, the pressure converged from two directions. The FBI intensified electronic surveillance. Informants were flipped quietly. Financial audits expanded. Meanwhile, the Nevada Gaming Commission began tightening scrutiny on casino ownership and hidden investors. Licensing hearings threatened to expose Midwest crime ties publicly. For Chicago, this was catastrophic potential. The skim depended on insulation. If hearings forced disclosure of concealed stakeholders, the revenue stream would collapse, and indictments could follow back to Illinois leadership. Spilotro's name surfaced repeatedly in investigative briefings, not as a silent guardian, but as a destabilizing presence. Reports described intimidation tactics against casino executives, unapproved violence, reckless associates under indictment, federal attention linked directly to his cruise burglaries. In Chicago's internal calculus, the question changed. It was no longer, is he loyal? It became, is he containable? Political escalation altered everything. Public trials meant transcripts. Transcripts meant names. Names meant leverage. The federal government did not need to win every charge. It only needed one cooperative witness. Drivers, associates, crew members facing prison. Pressure creates incentives. Chicago leadership understood the psychology of indictments. Fear spreads faster than loyalty. If even one insider cooperated, the skim's architecture could be mapped in court. Meetings were held quietly in the Midwest. Discussions were not emotional. They were financial. Las Vegas had been an asset. Now it was exposure. Spilotro's autonomy had created federal visibility. Federal visibility threatened revenue. Threatened revenue threatened hierarchy. And hierarchy in organized crime supersedes personality. The decision did not require anger, only arithmetic. Spilotro was summoned back to Chicago under the pretense of restoration, reconciliation, a reset. But in the outfit, when politics escalate beyond control, solutions become permanent. By 1986, the walls were closing in. Federal indictments in Chicago targeted high-ranking outfit members in what would later become known as the Strawman case. Allegations that Midwest mob figures secretly skimmed profits from Las Vegas casinos through concealed ownership structures. The skim was no longer rumor. It was courtroom evidence. Spilotro was not the only target, but he was the most visible liability. His burglary crew had already fractured. Several associates faced serious prison time. Conversations changed tone. Loyalty thinned under sentencing guidelines. The FBI understood leverage. And Chicago understood something worse. If Spilotro felt cornered, he might negotiate. Not out of cowardice, but out of survival. The outfit's hierarchy was built on insulation. Soldiers absorbed risk. Capos buffered exposure. Leadership remained distant. But Spilotro knew operational details. Cash movements, intermediaries, meeting patterns. He knew enough. That knowledge, combined with federal pressure, made him unpredictable. Communication from Chicago slowed to near silence. Messages came through intermediaries rather than direct calls. Invitations became vague. Promises of restored standing were floated but never formalized. Isolation is a method. It softens resistance. It signals evaluation without confrontation. Drivers and close associates noticed the shift. Meetings grew private. Spilotro's temper sharpened. He suspected surveillance. He suspected betrayal. But suspicion in organized crime is common. It does not confirm reality. The real decision occurred far from Nevada. In quiet discussions among Chicago leadership, the calculus hardened. The Vegas operation had already suffered. Reputational damage. Public trials loomed. Political scrutiny intensified. Removing Spilotro would not erase the federal case, but it would prevent escalation. And more importantly, it would demonstrate discipline. Organized crime survives through internal enforcement. When leadership eliminates one of its own, it sends a message to every other operative facing pressure. You do not act independently. You do not jeopardize revenue. You do not become larger than the structure. A meeting was arranged in Chicago. The invitation carried reassurance. Talk of reconciliation. Talk of rebuilding trust. Spilotro accepted. He did not travel alone. June 14, 1986. Bensonville, Illinois. Anthony Spilotro believed he was walking into restoration. The meeting location was familiar territory, suburban, quiet, controlled. He arrived with his brother Michael. No weapons, no visible tension. The invitation had implied promotion, a formal acknowledgement, a return to favor. Inside the house, several outfit members waited. The door closed. There was no argument, no negotiation. The assault was immediate. Fists first, then sustained blows. Methodical, punitive. A demonstration rather than a burst of rage. This was not street violence. It was sanctioned enforcement. Michael was beaten alongside him. Collateral by bloodline. In organized crime, proximity carries consequence. When the beating ended, both men were unconscious but alive. They were transported across state lines to a cornfield near Enos, Indiana. Rural, isolated, quiet. Shallow graves had already been prepared. The brothers were placed inside, buried while still breathing. No gunshots, no spectacle. Silence. The method mattered. It avoided forensic noise. It avoided immediate headlines. It conveyed internal judgment rather than public warning. Chicago denied involvement. Las Vegas feigned ignorance. Officially, the Spilotros were missing. Unofficially, the hierarchy had reset itself. The fatal mistake was not one act of violence. It was cumulative exposure, autonomy, visibility, political risk. In the end, the driver's proximity, the crew's recklessness, the federal indictments, all fed into one conclusion. The structure must survive. Individuals are replaceable. The bodies were discovered 3 days later. News spread quickly. Chicago newspapers called it gangland retaliation. Las Vegas media speculated about federal pressure. No one publicly connected it to internal authorization. But inside the outfit, the message was understood. Shortly after the murders, federal prosecutors intensified their case. The strawman trial moved forward. Hidden casino interests were exposed in court. Several high-ranking Chicago figures were eventually convicted under RICO statutes. The scheme collapsed. Corporate ownership began replacing mob-connected operators in Las Vegas. Regulatory oversight strengthened. The era of quiet count rooms and envelope flights diminished. Spilotro's removal did not stop the federal prosecutions, but it prevented further unpredictability. No defection. No courtroom revelations from him. No bargaining. Control was preserved. Within Chicago, leadership restructured. Roles shifted. Exposure was minimized. Surviving bosses adopted a lower profile. Less flash. Fewer public displays. The lesson had been internalized. Ambition without permission is rebellion. Rebellion invites discipline. Las Vegas evolved into a corporate gambling capital. Chicago's outfit retreated into quieter rackets. The cornfield became a symbol not of brutality alone, but of containment. September 14, 1986. A cornfield. 2 graves. No witnesses. Organized crime survives not through violence, but through hierarchy. Anthony Spilotro was not eliminated for brutality. He was eliminated for visibility. The fatal mistake was structural. He blurred the line between emissary and authority, between protection and control. In criminal enterprises, loyalty is conditional. Profit outweighs personality. Silence outweighs ego. The system that elevated him ultimately preserved itself by erasing him. In the end, the cornfield was not punishment. It was policy. And in organized crime, policy is always enforced.